In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Ajax using the inventory manager as an example. So just to remind you, what we're doing is when we go to sales items, we want to be able to create a new sales item, select a drop down, and have it update a field on the page without redrawing the entire page. That's the whole point of doing Ajax calls. So to remind you of the sequence here, the browser uses an XHR request to go to the Rails router. The router then goes to the categories controller, in this case, sending it a message notes. So it's going to access the action called notes in the categories controller, and then that will go to the category model. So what we're going to do in this video is kind of discuss, well, what are the steps that we need to go through in order to implement that entire thing. So let's look at the code. You could do this in any order, but the way I chose to do it was as follows. I decided to call the method notes. It could have any method name you wanted, but I just used this one. So I've got a category find, and you know that generally when you make one of these function calls to a controller, somehow you have to pass in an ID. So that's going to be part of what we need to pass in here. And we extract that from the parameters, and then we're going to render back JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, and we're just rendering back this object right here. So this is instead of rendering back HTML. And if we look in our views under categories, there is a JSON right here, and that's actually the class that gets called when we try to implement or when we try to render JSON. You can change this if you want to. This is just the default data. Okay, so now we have a method here. The second thing we need to do is make it so that we can access that method from the browser. And as usual, you have to do that through the routes file. So we're going to do routes. The way you do that is you say resources categories. We got this part just from the scaffolding, but now we want to tell it that we want a member function, and we want to use it with a get command, an HTML command, or HTTP rather, and then this is the method that we want to call. You need to do member when you're going to call it against a single element, and what this does is it also sets up the route so that it includes the database ID in the route. The other way that you can do this is with a collection, which you can see down here. And if you do that, it doesn't include the database ID in the route that you're going to get. So for our case, we need to pull back one particular category, so we want to use the word member here. Okay, so we have two steps so far. We do the categories controller, implement the method, go to the routes, implement this, and then now we can come back over to the browser and see if it works. So we'll go to categories here. Let's select one where we know that it's valid. So we've got this for. So the URL that's generated is going to be categories for/notes. And you can see what it does is it returns the JSON code that we requested. ID, name, created at, and the notes, and this is actually what we're interested in right here. Bear in mind, in my browser I have a plugin that does a little bit of fancy formatting. Yours may just show text across the top line, but it's the same thing. The next step is we need to prepare our form for getting the data back that we want, in other words, displaying the notes. And in this case, all we really needed to do, as we discussed in the last video, was add this notes on category span here, and this is an empty span, so that's what's going to be filled in by the JavaScript. So for this example, that's really all we needed to do. And of course, previously we had a drop down here that's the thing that we're capturing the data on. Now we're ready to implement the JavaScript. I went over most of this in the last video, but just to refresh, we have a line here, line 17, which handles the onChange event. So this is what captures the change in our dropdown, and when it captures that event, it calls update notes. That's the function up here. And what update notes does is it gets the value from the dropdown. That's what this line does. And then here it calls getJSON, which is part of jQuery, and it builds the URL so that it goes back to our notes function in the controller ultimately. And asynchronously, we get a message back from the controller that with the text in it that we need to display, or the JSON rather. And here we take the JSON and we extract the notes. So we discussed this in the last video, but this is the line that actually then updates the web page. Line 12 is an interesting one here. Line 12 waits for a TurboLinks load event. Now, TurboLinks is a library that comes with Rails. It's version 5 in Rails 5. If you use an earlier version of Rails, you may end up with version 2, and it works slightly differently. Version 5 was a complete rewrite, apparently, of the TurboLinks library. Essentially what TurboLinks does is it intercepts a lot of your calls underneath, even regular HTTP calls, and turns them into XHR calls. That can make the page work a lot faster. But if you don't configure it correctly, then you can run into a lot of trouble. Essentially what we do here is on the document itself, that's the $ document part here, we wait for the TurboLinks load event, and when that event fires, then we can call our function. So this happens the first time the page is loaded, and then on any subsequent loading of the page. If you don't put that in there, sometimes you end up having to do a refresh manually on the page to make stuff work, which nobody wants to do. It's very frustrating. So that's one thing that you might pay attention to. We've gone over what this is. This is where we capture the onChange event when we do the dropdown. This code right here waits for you to lift your key off of that sales item price text field. So you press the key down when you're going to type something in, and when you let off the key, that's when this function is going to fire. This line checks to see the value in that field, and if it's less than 1, then it's going to set in this ID that text. Otherwise, it's going to set here a text of blank. And so just to remind you in the browser, what that's doing is in our sales items, if we type in a number that is less than 1, we get a message that comes out here. That message, of course, is printed into the form in this blank tag. So again, just like we did for the drop-down message, we have to have a blank tag that we're going to populate. And notice its ID is price warning, and of course that's what we have to use here, price warning. So those are the basic steps. We start with determining how we want to approach it, what controller we need, and in our case we decided to go to the categories controller. We implement the method. We go then to the routes and implement a route, test it and make sure that that works. Then we go to our form and put in placeholders so that the JavaScript can work and populate fields. It'll have fields to go to. And then finally we do this. Now again, in real life, you might not do it that straightforwardly. What I end up doing is bouncing back and forth between many of these files, maybe just doing parts of the JavaScript, parts of the form. You do have to do the routes in the controller right away. But anyway, if you follow that general format, you should be just fine for implementing jQuery and Ajax calls.